When South Africa became a democracy in 1994, and many of its citizens were able to vote for the first time, it was a new beginning for many sectors of South African society. Old barriers and exclusions were removed, and a new constitution guaranteed equality and human rights. In the sphere of religion, it was no different. The new constitution guaranteed that all religions were now equal, and that there was no dominant religion that would get preference under law. But this new situation also brought new challenges for religions, internally and externally. The new constitution did not mean an amalgamation of religions, but guaranteed each religion its own unique place among the diversity of religious expression in a new South Africa. Among the diversity, each was guaranteed dignity. In this series, we will be exploring the dignity of difference in the midst of the diversity of religions in South Africa. We will take a look at the role of religion in South Africa pre-1994 and the role of religions played in the liberation struggle. We will also explore how religions adapted to a new situation after the dawn of democracy and how interfaith dialogue found expression in a series of charters. In addition, we will focus on a number of current-day interfaith organizations with a strong focus on interreligious communication and cooperation. And we will meet a number of individuals who are engaged in interfaith dialogue on a very personal level. Religion has been part of humanity's way of communicating with the divine, and it is a force that permeates many people's moral and ethical decision-making. In southern Africa, the first people were the Khoi and San, and their lives were infused by a religious understanding of the world, reflected in the art and rituals they left behind. Later on, various Bantu-speaking groups migrated into southern Africa and brought their religious practices with them in the form of African traditional religions. However, things radically changed when the first Europeans arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in the 1650s to establish a halfway station. This ad hoc settlement soon grew into a colonial outpost, first for the Dutch and later in the 1800s for the English. Both the Dutch and the English brought their many versions of Christianity with them, and as they gained political dominance, so too did their Christian religion gain a dominant place. Large parts of the indigenous populations were also Christianized in the early 1800s and early 20th century. In this colonial era, especially in Europe and the USA, the notion of white supremacy and separation of races was firmly entrenched. The idea that whites were superior also filtered down into church circles, and in southern Africa, in almost all churches, races were separated and worship conducted on a segregated basis. But apart from Christianity, many other religions also came to the country. At the University of Johannesburg, Professor Farid Esack teaches in the religions department. He says Islam was first brought to South Africa by an exile from Indonesia towards the end of the 1600s. His name was Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar.
Sheikh Yusuf Makassari, he was a leader of the liberation struggle in Dutch-occupied Indonesia, and as his name indicates, from the area of Makassar. And they were exiled, they were detained, and they were exiled to the Cape. And here they were held as prisoners, but in larger kinds of camps where they could also live, and they just needed to be watched. And so yes, they were a threat to the regime. And it is that history of our forefathers were liberation fighters that Muslims much later in the 70s and 80s tapped into and resuscitated for their purposes in the struggle against apartheid.
Between the 1820s and 1880s, a number of Jews from Eastern Europe migrated to South Africa and became part of South African society. They had good relationships with both the British colonial government as well as the Afrikaners in the Boer republics. One of the reasons for this relative welcoming reception was the fact that Jews were considered white. When Indians were brought in large numbers to South Africa by the British as indentured labourers in the late 1800s, they brought with them both Islam and the Hindu faith. Over time, a number of other versions of Christianity, such as Pentecostalism, also came to South Africa and became part of the religious landscape. Throughout the 19th century, the British were in charge in South Africa, except for a brief period in the mid-1800s, when a few Boer republics existed independently. They were finally conquered by the British in 1902 and ceased to exist. People of colour were increasingly harshly treated by British colonial powers, and from the 1890s, several laws were passed that deprived Indians and others of land ownership and a pass system that restricted their movement. This was also soon extended to black people. These measures resulted in a number of protests where people of different cultural groups, and indeed faith traditions, started to resist the new oppressive laws together. Some of the earliest organized protests came from the Indian community in what is today KwaZulu-Natal.
Well, in 1894, when the Natal Indian Congress was formed, that was putting in a seed which would grow into a whole big tree. And from 1894 onwards, the idea of protest was instilled in the people, that you need to protest against injustices. So it was in 1894 that the seed of non-violence was sown, and non-violent struggle, not just sitting back with non-violence, but actually using non-violence as a means of struggle. So that was sown then, and it was later accepted by all the other political organizations in the country. ANC was formed in 1912, and it also, was based on non-violent struggle. Chief Albert Luthuli actually voiced that, to say that we are going to struggle, but it will be a non-violent struggle. And that's when the Defiance campaigns and so on were waged. And all these things were combined, these protests were by all race groups. So it wasn't just one race group that was protesting. It was everyone. We all boycotted potatoes at that time.
So in protest against an increasingly unjust British rule, various groups were formed to oppose it, like the ANC that came into existence in 1912. The Natives Land Act of 1913 allocated only about 7% of arable land to Africans, leaving the more fertile land for whites. Many groups and Congress organizations protested to no avail.
The Congress movement, the Natal Indian Congress, then there was the Transvaal Indian Congress, and there was the Cape Indian Congress as well. And all got together and formed the South African Indian Congress. And that Congress movement was the voice of the people at that time. And they tried to demonstrate and, take up issues.
When the National Party came into power in 1948, an even harsher system of oppression of non-white races was introduced. The South African Indian Congress was soon joined by the African National Congress, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, the Coloured People's Congress, and the South African Congress of Democrats, which was a radical white anti-apartheid group. These groups included Christian, Muslim, Hindu, and Jewish religious leaders. Rabbi Dr. Warren Goldstein is the chief rabbi of the Union of Orthodox Synagogues in South Africa.
I think, for me, one of the great blessings of South Africa is that it is a country which is made up of so many faith communities. and that religion has deep, deep roots in the thinking and behavior and culture of South Africans.
The Congress Alliance, which was strongly influenced by the many religious leaders, put out a call for a Congress of the People. This national meeting was held in Kliptown in June 1955, and the Freedom Charter was adopted there. This was not only a symbol of internal resistance against apartheid, it was also a statement of the core principles and values of the members of the alliance. But as the resistance to apartheid grew, so did the violence of the state increase against those who dared to oppose it.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness.
That was Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd addressing the Commonwealth in 1961. What he neglected to say was that the good neighborliness only existed if the other neighbors complied to the oppressive measures of the National Party. If they dared to stand up or resist, retribution was swift and merciless. A good example of this was the Sharpeville massacre a year earlier, where people dared to protest harsh pass laws. Segregation intensified under the nationalist rule, and during this time many people of color were also forcefully relocated. They were confined to certain locations and had to have passes to travel to other areas. Rev Frank Chikane grew up under the system of apartheid.
Because of the injustices we experienced, the forced removals, the permit system in Soweto, the controls, because even if you were there and were stayed in those classical four-roomed houses, you were taken as a temporary sojourner. You are here as a worker, to work for somebody, white, and otherwise you shouldn't be there. So I still have my passbook, which would say permitted to be in the prescribed area of Johannesburg whilst you are a scholar. And the school had to sign in the passbook that you are in that school, otherwise you got arrested.
In the 1960s, the apartheid system became so oppressive that the ANC abandoned the notion of non-violence and decided to embark on an armed struggle. Retribution was swift, and the government arrested, killed, and tortured many activists. At the Rivonia trial in 1964, leaders like Nelson Mandela and others received life sentences for their involvement in what was considered sabotage. The trialists were from all races and all religions, united in a common struggle. Various organizations were banned and forced underground in the 1960s.
Dealing with that made the issues of justice part of our struggle and faith, and therefore had got to have an understanding that God can't be like this, especially if it's Christians who are doing that to you. You know what I'm talking about? We had to ask very critical questions. And that's why it was easier for us to talk about black theology, liberation theology, African theology, because the reality is that the system was negating your humanity. And if you were made in the image of God and you are being undermined by the system, treated like less than human being, forces you to develop theology about what it means to be an image of God. Yeah, if I'm an image of God and you undermine me, you are actually undermining God. We became ecumenists because if you are detained together, it doesn't matter whether you are Anglican, Methodist, Pentecostal. It really doesn't matter. So in Soweto, the churches used to work together. We used to support each other.
Professor Farid Esack grew up as a Muslim in a colored community in the Cape. In the township, Esack also experienced ecumenical and multi-faith interaction in a special way.
There wasn't any interactions between the churches and the mosque. But there was a lot of interaction between the Muslims and the Christians. So township life and that poverty, can I borrow 5 rand until Friday, please? This is how we lived in the townships. So inside the townships, commuting together on the factory floors, Muslims and Christians lived lives of common suffering together. There was a kind of solidarity, but this solidarity was simply happening at a communal level. It did not happen at a church-mosque level. There was absolutely no theological conflict between Christians, Muslims, and Hindus.
While there was very little formal interfaith communication between the various religious bodies, people on the ground were experiencing many interfaith moments because of their communal struggle against poverty and an oppressive regime. They even experienced it in unlikely places, such as a prison cell.
So when you are there in a cell where we're charged for treason, we had, all sorts of religious perspectives in the cell. And a Muslim will stop at 12:30 and pray there. And somebody of a Jewish tradition stops and prays. And, Christians are in the majority, of course. So in a sense, you learned to understand each other, when we were in the treason trial in the 1985-86 treason trial, Pietermaritzburg, we're kept in Durban, and the Indian communities, because we had Indians amongst us as leaders of the United Democratic Front, they planned to deliver food for us once a day. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoons, you will have food coming in boxes from one community and another community. And I enjoyed Indian food. And when we came to the treason trial, we stayed in some of the houses. You become integrated.
Reverend Chikane says when one is persecuted or incarcerated, trivial differences between religions and denominations begin to disappear.
So your pain and suffering creates a feeling of solidarity to an extent that your religious differences doesn't become a factor. Instead, you try to understand each other better and appreciate it rather than critique each other, because you've got enough problems to worry about, different religious traditions and different beliefs amongst Christians, differences between Anglicans and Catholics. It's irrelevant when you are facing life and death and you begin to merge it. Well, call it not merge, but convergence would be the better language. That you begin to see convergence where your belief in God becomes more important than the differences about how you baptize and, which are secondary issues.
Other struggle stalwarts like Seth Mazibuko also remembers how religions were forced to unite against apartheid.
The church itself stood up and said, we need to call other religions around the fight against apartheid. And there were a lot of structures, a lot of organizations that then came up. Some of them were organizations that were just doing simple community work, but that were church-based. And whilst doing that community work, developmental work and all this, were church-supported, were even interfaith from other religions. Can I make an example? In our case, in the 70s, we were supported by the Jewish community, the advocates of that time that defended us, 3 of them, Annie Wenzel, and all of them came from a very strong Jewish community. But guess what? They were instructed by a strong Muslim guy, Shan Shetty, and Priscilla Jana, and look at the way in which, these were working on their profession, but working and supported and funded by a Christian church. Now, here's the situation. The money comes from the Christian church, but the lawyer is Muslim or Hindu, and then instructs a Jewish advocate, and where even when we're in and we're awaiting trial, our food will come from even, all when they're bringing some food for us, it will come from these.
So during the 1960s and early 70s, there was very little formal interfaith liaison between religions in South Africa. However, at grassroots level, there was remarkable solidarity between faiths in their common struggle against a powerful oppressor. But as the oppression became more unbearable and the main apartheid activists were either jailed or exiled, religious organizations and groups realized that they had a greater role to play, and the struggle intensified. One group that played a major role in especially the 1980s was the United Democratic Front, or UDF, that brought many groups and religions together.
But there was an interesting dynamic to this coming together. There was, in fact, well before the 80s, from the early 70s, there was a smallish, not so regular interfaith group that met in Johannesburg. But there was a more consequential interfaith group in Cape Town called the Cape Town Interfaith Group. And they brought together some significant Muslim religious leaders and Jewish leaders and Christian leaders at a quarterly forum on the one hand, and on the other hand, they also published in the Argus a series of 3 religious opinions. What do the Jews say about this? What do the Christians say about this? What do the Muslims say about this? With the pictures. So there was some interreligious activity. In the 80s, with the formation of the UDF, there was a decision to ignore that group and start another interfaith group, because interfaith dialogue was about the conversation between people. And we recognize that the urgency of the moment was not how do we talk to people, but how do we mobilize our religious communities against apartheid. That took the form of interfaith gatherings, of interfaith gatherings, but interfaith protests and interfaith marches.
Many religions and religious leaders joined these initiatives, not because they had political ambitions, but because they were outraged at the immorality of the system.
We had a society in South Africa without any human rights. Archbishop Desmond Tutu got involved in the struggle against apartheid. He wasn't getting involved in politics. He was fighting for morality, for justice, for right and wrong. And that's really what we're talking about here. We know what a society looks like without rights, without human rights. That's apartheid. And we also took to the streets, and it was something that we felt very passionately about, not because we were looking to get involved in politics, because that's not the role of a religious leader. Religious leaders are not meant to be involved in politics, but we are meant to be involved in morality.
So in the 1980s, under the UDF banner, many people of faith and religious groups joined hands with other civic groups in various protest marches.
And in many ways, they were quite unique, or presented a unique problem to the police. Because the police were used to dealing with activists in their scruffy jeans and throwing stuff back at them. But now to be confronted by 20, 30, 40 clerics, clearly Muslim, clearly Hindu, clearly Christian, carrying Bibles in their hands, carrying Qurans in their hands, not stones, not weapon. And there was, I remember once, at a bridge between Bontjeville and Gugulethu, between Manenberg and Gugulethu, when we heard that the police were in fact going to attack parts of Gugulethu that day. So early in the morning we mobilized, and right at the top of the bridge there was this barrage of policemen on the Gugulethu side. We were on the Manenberg side, and we met each other on the bridge. We were pushing to go through, and they stopped us, and we refused to retreat. And then we all knelt, And then this guy, I think it was, it was a policeman. His nickname was Dolph. And he spoke into his mouthpiece and says, "Jy, die bliksems kniel nou en bid. Wat doen ons nou met hulle?"
The UDF was a crucial organization in the struggle against apartheid. It fostered informal interfaith dialogue. Another organization that was really telling was the South African Council of Churches, or the SACC.
Well, I was privileged to be at one stage the Secretary General of the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference. And in that position, I worked very closely with the South African Council of Churches, which promoted what was called the ecumenical movement that tried to mobilize the churches as a whole. But what was very important about it was the manner in which also the theologians played a very important role, to such an extent that in 1985 we then produced what came to be known as the Kairos document, which of course did not please the powers that be very much. But it was also not just a critique of the political system, but it was also a critique of the role of the church, itself.
It severely criticized churches like the Dutch Reformed Church that fully supported apartheid and even legitimized it from the Bible. But it also did not spare other mainline churches that were ostensibly against apartheid but did not act against the system.
And then the Kairos document then came along and say there should be a third kind of theology, which is called prophetic theology. And that was a theology that also said to the mainline missionary churches, you too, you're probably soft pedaling a little bit, and whilst you may criticize the other side, people that were promoting what we called state theology, once you criticize them because of apartheid and the practice of apartheid and so on, and social discrimination, what have you, you are not going far enough yourselves. And therefore they needed a voice that was not always bound by the church structures.
The SACC became a major force in the struggle against apartheid and for social justice after the Sharpeville massacre. The organization started to work together with the Christian Institute of Dr. Beyers Naudé in 1968 on many levels. Under prominent SACC leaders such as Naudé, Desmond Tutu and Frank Chikane, the organization made a difference in people's lives and fought the regime inside and outside the country. After the Soweto students' uprising, the SACC realized the struggle was inclusive of all religions.
1976 introduced a new terrain because from then on, it was no longer about Christian churches. It was about people of faith. Because, again, why? Because it was in loco. There was no way you're going to say you're going to deal with issues in Bonteheuwel and Heiderveld in the Cape Flats only with Christians and not also with Muslims. There's no way you're going to say you're going to deal with these challenges in Lenasia without Hindus and Muslims. You can't do this without recognizing that all of us were primarily South Africans that need to make a difference in our society, and that we use the influence and the support of our religious anchoring to drive the agenda for social justice. And that's what we all did as South Africans. And that is what would have led to the relationship that we built between the churches, the Jews for Justice, and the Muslim Judicial Council, for example.
The South African Council of Churches played a very, very important role. And it was representative of most of the, if not nearly all of the Reformed or the Protestant churches inside South Africa. The South African South African Bishops' Conference had an associative relationship with the SACC, and the SACC in many ways did an absolutely brilliant job of presenting itself as the front for all of these churches. But its constituent bodies weren't nearly as supportive of the SACC as they let on. It was the prophetic characters of the Frank Chikanes and the Beyers Nodis and the Tutus and the Manas Buthelezis that managed to project the SACC as this powerful body. And of course the SACC, in all fairness, wouldn't have been able to do this if it weren't for the solidarity from the churches abroad, the churches in Sweden, in Norway, in Germany, Christian Aid in the United Kingdom.
So, in addition to being a major forum for ecumenical dialogue in the 1970s and 1980s, the SACC also became an important forum for interreligious and interfaith dialogue. However, this interfaith dialogue was not part of an official SACC program.
It was not structured. There wasn't something that says, now let's come together as different faith traditions to do this. It didn't happen like that. It happened organically because people experienced. I mean, you would get, let's say, the protests that were up at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. It had nothing to do with whether you were Anglican, if you were a Christian. It had nothing to do with whether you were a Christian at all. People just went there. and you know, when Regina Mundi was a place of protest, it had no relevance what your faith was. But the truth is, people came from different faiths. It was all organic. And I'm saying that the more we build on that spirit, which is a human spirit at every level, we're likely to find our interfaith experience much more as a lived experience than depending on our leaders to sign documents.
Esack echoes this and says that even in the struggle years, it was not really institutionalized religion that had the biggest impact.
A disproportionately large number of Jews were in the Rivonia trial. And in South Africa's liberation struggle, Jews played a significant role, and a disproportionate role to their number, and so did Muslims. But we have to make a distinction. They participated in the liberation struggle despite their communities, not because of their communities. Both the Muslim community and the Jewish community, if the majority of those communities and the leaderships, the religious leaderships of those communities, if they could have had their way, then these individuals that participated in the liberation struggle would not have been active in it. But to some extent, it's also true for the church. Beyers Nodi, Ellen Busak, Samngaliso Mkhatshwa, Sister Bernadette Mkube, Desmond Tutu, these people, they weren't there because the churches sent them there. They were there despite the churches. So we, and now I'm talking about the activists, we are generous in not drawing their attention to the fact, where were you really? Today you're talking as if all of us were there. Okay, fine, you know, as they say in Afrikaans, "Vat jy maar die wen." You can take the win, you know. We're not into seeking the credit. But they also have to be honest and upfront with themselves about where they were.
And in 1990, relentless pressure on the apartheid government, both from within South Africa and from the international community, finally had an effect. Apartheid crumbled. Anti-apartheid organizations were unbanned and Nelson Mandela was released.
Into a new South Africa.
A new era had dawned for South Africa. Of course, a multitude of factors combined to bring about the change, but the role that religions and religious traditions played can hardly be overstated. But the dawn of a new South Africa presented religions and religious communities with unexpected challenges.
For the nomination of Nelson Mandela.
When a new democratic South Africa was created in 1994, It was based on a constitution that guaranteed human rights. It also leveled the playing field in terms of religions. Up to 1994, the Dutch Reformed Church, and indeed Christianity, were in a privileged position. Under the new constitution, church and state were separated, and all religions had the same rights and privileges.
One of the remarkable things about the new South Africa is that it has little patience with a triumphalist majoritarianism. We are Christians, therefore the country must be a Christian country. And the Christians in our country have been remarkably generous in this regard. There is no reason why there should be a Muslim, a Jewish, a Hindu, a Rastafarian, a Baha'i speaking or preaching at the opening of the conference of the African National Congress, less even at the inauguration of the president of the country of South Africa. And yet South Africa goes through all of these rituals. The playing field has been leveled in a way that makes South Africa the freest country in the world for any religious minority. Muslims and Jews and Hindus.
So in South Africa, there is a tradition where there are deliberate steps taken to ensure that the various religions are included in public and government events. However, the high regard the Constitution has for religion is also evident in a curious stipulation about language.
Our Constitution speaks about the 11 official languages. And then it says, and we shall also recognize and pay respect to the other sacred languages of our people. And then it names 3: Hebrew, Sanskrit, and Arabic. Why on earth would you want to mention Hebrew, Arabic, and Sanskrit? It's just an acknowledgement of the value of the Hindu community, of the value of the Jewish community, of the value of the Muslim community. Now, in numerical terms, the Jewish community, less than 50,000 in South Africa, less than 1%. Why should we care tuppence about them? Muslims are less than 2% of the population. Hindus about 1% of the population. But it is the whole idea that an inclusive society nods and takes its hat off, nods, I recognize you. And so South Africa is a remarkably free place.
Interreligious dialogue continues to be valued under the new constitution, and interfaith prayers is not an exception, even in Parliament.
Dear Lord, please show us the
This prayer meeting was held in 2015.
We must give credit to our experience of struggle, because that's what made us to understand each other, cross-religious, interfaith. We worked together, we were in prison together, we were tortured together. Some were sentenced and served sentence. Even if they separate you, after sentencing you, the white guy gets to a white prison site and the black guys in a black prison site. We learned to understand each other. So South Africa is one of the countries where you don't have a religious problem amongst the people. In the United Democratic Front, we're perfectly integrated. If you take the Constitution, we are a majority Christians in this country. I was the General Secretary of the Council of Churches. We made sure we did interfaith meetings to agree on the constitution we would want to have.
So on the one hand, the experience under apartheid resulted in a remarkable interfaith unity. But on the other hand, the exceptionally strong focus on the struggle had some negative effects as well. In the breaking down of apartheid, churches, religious groups and activists inspired by their faith played a major role. However, the strong focus on and identification with the struggle have caused some problems in the post-1994 era, when the religious playing field was levelled and the ANC came to power.
My problem also with post-1994, churches and interfaith movement identified with parties. Their church uniform and their religious uniform became a party uniform, and you had to be wearing a particular party uniform. And that then divided not only their policies and their programs, but also divided them as the church. The church and the interfaith movement need to see itself not from the party perspective, need to see itself from the community, from the society perspective, from the people's perspective. Actually, they need to even unite parties. They need to be saying to parties, there are people, there are not persons, and you don't see the person people, you just see people as people.
Another problem that emerged post-1994 is that religions and churches that were very much involved in social justice during apartheid were not as critical of government and political leaders as they were under apartheid. There was also less involvement with other social issues after 1994. There was the general idea that the struggle was over, and it was now again time for church and religious matters.
Even some of the leaders of the churches, they got involved in the struggle because they were actually outraged by the excesses, I think, of apartheid. But many of them did not really understand that justice by its nature was an integral part of the work of the of the church. So that's why then some of them were quite happy, and they actually almost, some of them, opted out of, if you like, social activism, which would have been the continuation of the struggle for justice. Because the reality is that very soon after 1994, I think people, I include myself, as church leaders and so on and so on, I think the reality made us sober again, open our eyes to say, oh, there is still poverty that we've got to fight. There are still elements of racial hostility and so on. Oh, we still have a situation where there are so many social pathologies, a problem with drugs, the problem of dishonesty, the problem of political leaders. Instead of being the servants of the people, suddenly a new mentality developed, and they saw themselves more or less as bosses, as people benefiting from the, material goods. Some of them that were meant for the poor and the majority of the people, and so on.
Although apartheid was over, a large number of social ills and problems were still plaguing South Africa. Extreme poverty, high crime rates, an HIV epidemic, rampant corruption, and so on. It was as if churches and religions were almost too complacent and too little involved in this directly after 1994.
In 1994, Mandela, I think, summarized it all when he called for the RDP of the soul. He summarized it very well, because when he looked at the documents called Ready to Govern, they were mostly produced by the ANC, but also other scholars and so on. Practically all of them were addressing issues of physical structure in terms of the transformation, of the country. Purely narrow political issues, the economy, obviously. Now, all these were issues that had to be addressed, very, very important. Then, when he made this statement, he said, comrades, I noticed that you have done a very good work, but there's something missing, one element of your good work. You are not addressing the responsibility of Ubuntu, because what apartheid is, it destroyed the spirit of Ubuntu. Human solidarity, sympathy, understanding for other people and so on, readiness to forgive and so on. In fact, it did almost the opposite. So for me, says Mandela, part of the building of a new nation should be based also on values, ethical values, spiritual values, because a human being, unlike an animal, is made up of body and soul. And I feel spiritually your program seems to be hungry. And I'm therefore calling for the RDP of the soul.
This was a wake-up call for many in the country and refocused religious people's attention on a new kind of social justice that has become necessary. President Mandela followed up on this idea, and in 1997, the Moral Regeneration Movement was formed. However, in the new South Africa, the new challenges, new religious freedoms, and an obligation to also remain critical of the new government and social injustices meant that religious groupings had to address this. There was also the sense that this could only be accomplished if different faiths started to collaborate. In due course, a number of organizations aimed at cooperation between religions were formed. A number of charters were drawn up to guide the involvement of religion and religious groups with civil society and government.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.